happened 3 years ago in the dead of winter. My uncle had passed away, and my family inherited a small hunting cabin deep in the mountains. My dad, being the adventurous type, decided we'd drive up there to check it out and spend the weekend. My mom wasn't thrilled about the idea. She hated the cold, but my dad promised it would be a bonding experience for me and him. We packed up on a Friday afternoon, food, blankets, lanterns, the works, and headed into the mountains. By the time we arrived, it was nearly dark, and the snow had started falling heavily. The cabin was exactly what you'd expect. Old, wooden, and isolated. It sat in a clearing surrounded by pines, the kind of place where you could scream your lungs out and no one would hear you. The inside of the cabin was in decent shape. It had a couple of old beds, a wood stove, and a kitchen with a rusty sink. Dad lit the lanterns and we got to work warming up the place. After dinner, we sat by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside. "Quiet out here, huh?" Dad said, stretching back in his chair. I nodded. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Then I heard it, a faint thud from somewhere above us. I froze. "Did you hear that?" Dad waved it off. "It's an old house, probably the snow shifting on the roof." But I wasn't so sure. The sound had been deliberate, like someone dropping something heavy. That night, we turned in early. The temperature had dropped, and the wind was so loud it felt like it was shaking the cabin. I pulled the blankets tight around me and tried to sleep. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was completely silent. The wind had stopped. I sat up, blinking into the darkness. That's when I heard it again. Thud, 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 slow, rhythmic like footsteps coming from the attic above us. I held my breath, straining to hear. My dad was snoring softly in the other bed, completely oblivious. "Dad," I whispered, but he didn't wake up. The footsteps continued, moving across the ceiling, then stopping directly above me. I pulled the blankets over my head, squeezing my eyes shut. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I told Dad what I'd heard. He shrugged it off again. Probably just animals in the attic. Squirrels or raccoons. "Dad, those weren't animals," I said. "It sounded like someone walking." He looked at me, frowning. "There's nobody out here for miles. Stop scaring yourself." But I wasn't imagining it. That afternoon, while Dad was chopping firewood outside, I decided to check out the attic. I climbed the narrow staircase in the corner of the cabin, the wood creaking under my weight. The air up there was freezing, and the room was small, with a slanted roof and one dusty window. Old furniture was pushed against the walls. Chairs, a table, even a broken rocking horse. As I turned to leave, I saw it. A footprint in the dust. It was large, too big to be mine or Dad's, and it led toward the window. I ran downstairs, slamming the attic door shut behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint noises. The groan of the wood, the rustle of something moving outside. Around midnight, I heard Dad get up. I figured he was going to the bathroom, but when I opened my eyes, I saw his bed was empty. "Dad," I whispered. There was no response. The cabin felt wrong, too still, too quiet. I grabbed a lantern and crept toward the front door. It was open, just slightly, and cold air was seeping inside. When I stepped out onto the porch, I saw Dad standing at the edge of the clearing, facing the trees. "Dad," I called softly, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just stood there, perfectly still, as the snow swirled around him. I started walking toward him, but as I got closer, I noticed something strange. His head was tilted back, and he was whispering. His breath fogged in the cold, but his words made no sound. "Dad," I said again, louder this time. He turned slowly to face me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. His eyes, they weren't right. They were wide, unblinking, and completely black. I don't remember screaming. I just remember running back into the cabin, slamming the door, and locking it behind me. I could hear something moving outside, circling the house, but I didn't dare look out the window. Eventually, I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, approaching the porch. They stopped at the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. "Let me in," a voice said softly. It was my dad's voice, but it wasn't him. I stayed huddled in the corner until the first light of dawn. When I finally dared to open the door, there was no sign of my dad, just his footprints leading from the cabin to the trees. Search teams found him 2 days later, wandering through the woods, half frozen and delirious. He didn't remember anything. Not leaving the cabin, not standing in the snow, not whispering into the night. But sometimes, when we talk about that trip, he'll pause, his brow furrowing, and say, "It felt like someone was calling me." I don't know what was out there that night, but I do know this: we weren't alone in that cabin. And whatever it was, it wanted us to let it in. A few winters back, I took up a temporary job as a caretaker for an old lodge in Colorado. The place sat deep in the mountains, accessible only by a winding road that cut through miles of thick forest. It had been a fancy ski lodge decades ago, but now it was used sparingly for small gatherings or private retreats. My job was simple: keep the place heated, check the pipes, and make sure the snow didn't pile up too much on the roof. I didn't mind the solitude, it was quiet, and the pay was decent. The lodge was massive, far too big for one person, and I spent most of my time in a small caretaker's apartment on the main floor. The rest of the place felt like it had been forgotten, with dusty furniture, creaking floorboards, and faded decorations from the 70s still hanging on the walls. My days were spent clearing snow, making minor repairs, and reading by the wood-burning stove. At first, I found the isolation peaceful, even comforting. But as the days stretched into weeks, I began to feel watched. Started small. I would hear sounds at night, soft tapping, like someone walking on the floors upstairs. The first few times, I dismissed it as the building settling or animals outside. But then I noticed the lights. It was just after dusk, and I was in my apartment reading when I saw it. A faint glow reflecting off the snow outside. It came from one of the lodge's upstairs windows, flickering like candlelight. I frowned, confused. I hadn't been upstairs in days, and I knew there were no working lights up there. The power barely worked in most of the lodge. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the main hallway, my boots echoing off the wooden floors. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed to the second floor, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The halls up there were darker, colder, as if the warmth from the stove didn't quite reach. When I reached the room where I'd seen the glow, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling into the hall. I pushed it open with my flashlight and shone the beam inside. The room was empty. The old furniture was covered in sheets, and the windows were frosted over. But there was no sign of light, no candles, nothing that could explain the glow. I checked the room quickly, then chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe I'd seen moonlight reflecting off the snow. But the next night it happened again. This time, the glow came from the far end of the lodge, where the old ballroom was. I knew better than to ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way through the silent, shadowed halls. The ballroom doors were heavy and ornate, with carvings of trees and animals etched into the wood. When I pushed them open, the flashlight beam revealed a cavernous room, the floor covered in a thin layer of frost. I swept the beam around, checking for anything out of place. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They started in the center of the room, perfectly clear in the frost, and led toward the far wall. There were no prints leading into the room, just the ones that began right there, as if someone had simply appeared. The prints were strange, too long and narrow, with an unnatural gait, like whoever made them was dragging their feet. I didn't stick around to investigate. I turned and left the ballroom, locking the doors behind me. That night I barely slept. Every sound, the creak of the wood, the howl of the wind, felt like it was coming from inside the lodge. At one point, I could have sworn I heard someone whispering just outside my apartment door, but when I checked, the hall was empty. The next morning, I told myself I was letting the isolation get to me. I focused on clearing the snow outside, trying to keep busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced back at the lodge, I swore I saw movement in one of the windows, just the faintest flicker of a shadow. That evening, as I sat by the stove trying to distract myself with a book, I saw it again. The light. This time, it wasn't just one glow. It was multiple, flickering in different windows all across the second floor. It looked like the lodge was full of people. I grabbed the flashlight, but this time, I also grabbed an old fire poker I'd found earlier in the maintenance room. I wasn't taking any chances. I made my way upstairs, my boots heavy on the steps. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. The lights had stopped by the time I reached the top of the stairs, but something else had appeared. The footprints. They were everywhere. They crisscrossed the halls, leading in and out of rooms, some fresh, others half-faded as if they'd been there for days. I followed the most distinct set of tracks to the ballroom again, my heart pounding in my chest. The doors were open. Inside, the air was freezing, and frost coated the walls like a thin layer of ice. I shone my flashlight across the room and froze. There, in the center of the ballroom, stood a group of figures. They were shadowy, their outlines faint, but I could see them swaying gently, as if moving to music I couldn't hear. The light from my flashlight seemed to bend around them, as though they weren't entirely real. I stumbled backward, the beam shaking wildly. One of the figures turned toward me, its face pale and hollow, its eyes black pits that seemed to suck in the light. Slowly, it raised one long, thin arm and pointed at me. I ran. I sprinted back to my apartment, slamming the door and locking it behind me. I could hear footsteps in the halls, slow, deliberate, following me. I barricaded myself inside, clutching the fire poker like it would do any good. For hours, I sat there in the dark, listening. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The lodge was silent again. At dawn, I grabbed my things and left. I didn't care about the job or the money. I just wanted out. I drove straight to town, not stopping once to look back at the lodge. A week later, I called the property manager to explain that I wouldn't be coming back. He didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first to leave early," he said. "People always hear things in that place." When I asked about the lodge's history, he told me the ballroom used to host extravagant parties back in the 1920s, but one winter, an avalanche trapped a group of guests inside. By the time rescuers arrived, everyone was dead. Now, when the snow starts to fall, people say the guests come back to dance. I don't know what I saw that night, but I still dream about the figures in the ballroom. The way they moved, the way one of them turned to look at me, and in the silence of winter, when the wind howls against my windows, I sometimes hear it again. The faint sound of music carried on the cold air. When I was 13, my best friend Liam and I used to spend every waking moment together. Our neighborhood was surrounded by a dense forest, and with little else to do, we often played games outside. It was a different time, before everyone was glued to their phones. Most evenings, we would play hide and seek, our own special version where the seeker had to use a flashlight at all times. The rules were simple. The flashlight had to stay on, and if the beam hit you, you were caught. We usually kept to the streets around our houses, but when we wanted to up the stakes, we'd venture into the woods. That's where things got interesting. One particular winter evening, we decided to play in the snow-covered forest. The moon was bright enough to reflect off the snow, and we thought it would make for a perfect game. I was the hider this time, and wanting to impress Liam, I told myself I'd go farther than ever before. As I trudged deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization faded behind me, swallowed by the thick blanket of snow. My boots crunched softly with every step, and my breath fogged in the cold air. I kept glancing behind me, trying to spot Liam's flashlight in the distance, but I didn't see it. After what felt like forever, I stumbled across an old, weathered cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by trees weighed down by ice and snow. I don't know what compelled me to go inside. Maybe it was the thrill of the game, or maybe I just wanted to get out of the cold. Either way, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and musty, its wooden floorboards groaning under my weight. There were signs that someone had been here once. An old chair, a broken table, but everything was coated in a thick layer of frost. A narrow staircase led to an upper floor, and I climbed it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The second floor was little more than a single room with a cracked window facing the woods. I sat down against the far wall, trying to quiet my breathing as I waited for Liam. I imagined how surprised he would be when he couldn't find me, how I'd win the game easily. That's when I saw him. Out of the window, I spotted a figure moving through the trees. It was Liam, at least I thought it was. His silhouette moved slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the snow. But something was wrong. He wasn't using the flashlight properly. The beam was shaky, flickering on and off as if he were deliberately covering it. I thought he might be cheating, trying to sneak up on me without being seen. I watched as he walked closer and closer to the cabin, the flashlight bouncing in the darkness. Then I heard footsteps. They were coming from inside the cabin, downstairs. At first, I thought maybe Liam had already found me, that he'd circled around and entered without me noticing. "Nice try, Liam," I called out, my voice cracking slightly, but there was no answer. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate. My stomach dropped as I realized that they were too heavy to be Liam's. I glanced out the window again and froze. Liam was still outside, his flashlight now pointed straight at the cabin. I hid under the bed, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps moved closer, climbing the stairs. Each creak of the wood sent shivers through me. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was wouldn't find me. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. From my hiding spot, I could see a pair of boots, large, heavy boots, step into the room. They stopped just a few feet from the bed, facing the window. For what felt like an eternity, the figure didn't move. Then, slowly, the boots turned and left the room. I waited, barely daring to breathe, until I was sure the figure was gone. Then, in a burst of panic-fueled adrenaline, I scrambled out from under the bed, climbed onto the windowsill, and jumped. I hit the snow hard, my ankle twisting painfully, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could through the trees, my breath ragged and uneven. Behind me, I heard faint footsteps. Someone was following me, matching my pace. When I reached the edge of the woods, I saw Liam standing there, his flashlight pointed directly at me. "I see you," he shouted, grinning. "I win." But when he saw the look on my face, and the figure emerging from the trees behind me, his grin vanished. "Run," I gasped. Without another word, we sprinted back to my house, not stopping until we slammed the front door shut and locked it. Both of us stood there, panting, staring at each other in shock. "What happened?" Liam finally asked, his voice trembling. I told him everything about the cabin, the footsteps, and the figure in the boots. As I described the man standing at the top of the stairs, Liam's face paled. "You mean it wasn't me?" he whispered. Then, who was in the cabin? I didn't know how to answer. Later that night, my parents called the police. They searched the area, including the cabin, but didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of life, just an empty, abandoned cabin surrounded by snow. Liam and I never played hide and seek in the woods again. We couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been out there with us that night. And to this day, whenever I see fresh snow, I can't help but think of those heavy boots, pacing slowly up the stairs. And I wonder if someday, I'll hear them again.